Oberst Werner Streib stood in the operations room of Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin on November 3, 1943, studying reconnaissance photographs spread across the briefing table. The images showed American carrier task forces off the Gilbert Islands, decks crowded with aircraft that intelligence analysts were struggling to identify. Single-engine fighters, stocky, brutish-looking, nothing like the graceful lines of the Mitsubishi Zero or the aggressive angles of the Focke-Wulf 190. Streib had seen scattered reports about this aircraft over the past 2 months. American pilots called it the Hellcat. His intelligence officers estimated the Americans had perhaps 500 of them in the Pacific theater, possibly more being produced, but at rates Germany considered achievable for quality fighters. 500 aircraft spread across a dozen carriers meant each vessel carried maybe 40 fighters. Manageable numbers, concerning but not catastrophic. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Streib didn't know, what German intelligence had fundamentally failed to grasp, was that 500 wasn't the American fleet strength. 500 was roughly how many Hellcats Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation was producing every single month by mid-1944. The final production total would reach 12,275 aircraft. 12,000 fighters that would collectively achieve a 19-to-1 kill ratio against Axis aircraft, the most dominant air superiority fighter record in military aviation history. The story of how this happened reveals everything about industrial warfare that Germany's leadership refused to believe. The numbers made no sense to German military planners. The Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's premier fighter aircraft, required approximately 4,000 man-hours to build. German factories, with skilled craftsmen and precision tooling, were producing roughly 380 Focke-Wulf 190s per month by late 1943. That represented the maximum output Germany's industrial capacity could sustain. The Americans were supposedly producing Hellcats at rates exceeding 500 monthly, while simultaneously building thousands of other aircraft types: bombers, transport planes, trainers, reconnaissance aircraft. Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, dismissed these figures as American propaganda. He told Hitler that the United States could build proper refrigerators but not proper fighters, that reports of American industrial capacity were gross exaggerations designed to demoralize the German fighting spirit. This wasn't ignorance. German intelligence had exceptional sources. Before the war, German military attachés in Washington had compiled detailed assessments of American manufacturing capability. They understood American automotive production, the massive factories, the assembly line techniques pioneered by Henry Ford. But understanding intellectually and accepting emotionally are different processes. German military culture was built around craftsmanship, precision engineering, the superiority of German technical expertise. The idea that Americans could simply overwhelm quality with quantity seemed to violate fundamental principles of warfare. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley pulled his F-6 F-3 Hellcat into a sharp climbing turn over Tarawa Atoll at 1400 hours on November 23, 1943, leading Fighting Squadron 5 from USS Yorktown. Below, Marines were dying on beaches, while above, Japanese Zero fighters climbed to contest American air superiority. This was exactly the scenario the Hellcat had been designed for. Flatley's division spotted 6 Zeros at 11,000 feet, climbing aggressively, their pilots confident in aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years. The Zeros were magnificent fighters, lightweight, maneuverable, capable of outturning anything the Americans had fielded until mid-1943. They could complete a full circle in 14 seconds at combat speeds. The Hellcat needed 19 seconds. In pure dogfighting, the Zero held advantages Japanese pilots had exploited ruthlessly. But Flatley didn't dogfight. He'd studied the after-action reports from Guadalcanal, where Wildcat pilots learned that trying to turn with Japanese fighters was suicide. The Hellcat gave American pilots different advantages that mattered more than turn radius. At 15,000 feet, Flatley's Hellcat was faster than the Zero, 380 miles per hour versus the Zero's 340. The Hellcat could dive at 450 miles per hour without structural failure. The Zero's maximum dive speed was 360 miles per hour. Beyond that, the wings risked catastrophic failure. More critically, the Hellcat could absorb punishment. Flatley's aircraft had 212 pounds of armor plate protecting the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks using multiple layers of rubber that swelled when punctured, armored engine cowling that could stop 20mm cannon rounds. The Zero had none of this. Japanese designers prioritized maneuverability over survivability, building aircraft so light that a single burst of machine gun fire through the fuel tank would ignite it. This design philosophy made sense for short wars of aggression. It was catastrophic for wars of attrition. The engagement opened when Lieutenant J. Twentyman dove on the lead Zero from 17,000 feet, building speed to 420 miles per hour. His 650 caliber machine guns converged at 400 yards, delivering devastating firepower. The Japanese pilot broke hard right, pulling into a climbing turn that Twentyman couldn't match. The Zero gained 300 feet, exactly as designed. But Twentyman didn't try to follow. He dove away, using his superior diving speed to disengage, climbed back to altitude using the energy from his dive, and repositioned for another attack. This was the Hellcat's tactical doctrine: use speed and structural strength to dictate engagement terms. Never turn with Zeros, always attack from altitude, always maintain energy advantage. When a Zero got behind Ensign Robert Burnett's Hellcat and opened fire with 20mm cannons, 3 explosive rounds hit Burnett's aircraft. One struck the armor plate behind his seat, denting it severely but not penetrating. One hit his left wing, blowing a hole through the aileron the size of a dinner plate. The third shredded his elevator, destroying half the trim surface. Burnett's Hellcat kept flying. The armor stopped the round that should have killed him. The wing's robust structure maintained enough rigidity, despite the damage, that he retained control. He flew that crippled aircraft 90 miles back to Yorktown, landed successfully on a pitching carrier deck, and was flying a replacement Hellcat the next morning. The aircraft he'd flown absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any Japanese fighter. The reverse scenario played out differently. When Flatley's guns struck a Zero's engine, the aircraft immediately began trailing smoke. Zeros had minimal engine armor, sacrificing protection for weight savings. Cooling fins shattered, oil lines ruptured, and within 30 seconds the engine seized. The Japanese pilot had no choice but to bail out over the ocean. Another Zero took hits to its fuel tank, which wasn't self-sealing. Fuel streamed out in visible vapor, then ignited from engine heat. The pilot rode that aircraft down in flames. No chance for bailout, no chance for survival. By the time the engagement ended 12 minutes after it began, Fighting Squadron 5 had shot down 18 Zeros. Not a single Hellcat was lost. 4 Hellcats had battle damage. All 4 flew home. All 4 were repaired within 48 hours using standardized replacement parts kept aboard the carrier. The Tarawa engagement was a microcosm of what was coming. But the story of how America produced 12,000 Hellcats begins not with combat, but with engineering decisions made in a Long Island office building in July 1942. Leroy Grumman walked into his Bethpage, New York engineering facility on July 30, 1942, carrying the Navy's requirements for a new carrier fighter and a philosophy that would define American military production for the next 80 years. Don't reinvent what already works. His team had 18 months to deliver a combat-ready fighter. 18 months wasn't enough time to develop exotic engines, test revolutionary wing designs, or perfect complex hydraulic systems. It was barely enough time to assemble proven components into a better combination. Every decision Grumman made prioritized production efficiency over engineering elegance. The engine choice came first, and determined everything that followed. Grumman selected the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the same power plant already driving the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and Chance Vought F-4U Corsair. 2,000 horsepower, 18 cylinders, air-cooled radial design. More importantly, Pratt & Whitney had already established production lines, no waiting for prototype engines. No debugging fuel injection systems. The R2800 had logged thousands of flight hours across multiple aircraft types. Mechanics understood how to maintain it. Supply chains existed to deliver spare parts. Using this engine saved 8 months of development time and eliminated the single biggest cost and schedule risk in aircraft design. This decision violated German engineering philosophy completely. German aircraft manufacturers prided themselves on custom engines designed specifically for each airframe. The Focke-Wulf 190 used the BMW 801 radial engine, designed exclusively for that aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 used the Daimler-Benz 605 liquid-cooled inline engine, again purpose-built. This approach produced exceptional performance when everything worked correctly. It also meant that engine problems grounded entire fighter fleets because no alternative power plants existed. When BMW 801 production couldn't meet demand in 1943, Focke-Wulf 190 output collapsed. Grumman's philosophy was different. Use proven components that multiple manufacturers could supply. Chief Engineer William Schwendler rejected fancy elliptical wings or innovative laminar flow designs for the Hellcat. The aircraft got simple straight wings with slight dihedral angle. Structurally straightforward, easy to manufacture with standard riveting techniques. The wing design used exactly 621 individual parts. Compare that to the Corsair's inverted gull wing, requiring 943 precisely matched components. Fewer parts meant faster assembly, lower rejection rates at quality control, and critically, cheaper per-unit costs. Every design choice reflected this pragmatism. The fuselage used aluminum alloy sheets in standard gauges that rolling mills already produced for bombers. The landing gear was simple, robust, folding backward into wings without complex rotation systems. One test pilot described it as agricultural equipment attached to an aircraft. He meant it as compliment. Agricultural equipment doesn't fail. Grumman obsessed over pilot survivability in ways Japanese designers never considered. The Hellcat received self-sealing fuel tanks using multiple layers of rubber that swelled when punctured, automatically stopping leaks. These tanks cost an extra $800 per aircraft. Grumman installed them anyway. The cockpit sat behind a massive firewall, 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot's head and back. The windscreen was bulletproof glass, actually tested by shooting it with 50 caliber rounds until engineers were satisfied. This armor added 400 pounds, weight that didn't make the Hellcat faster or more maneuverable, but it meant pilots survived hits that would kill them in lighter aircraft. The weapons package was deliberately simple. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 per wing, not the most ammunition per gun, 400 rounds versus the Corsair's 475. But 6 guns meant redundancy. Lose 2 to battle damage, you still had 4 functioning. The guns were positioned outboard in the wings, away from the fuselage, so hits to one didn't disable others. Ammunition boxes used standard military containers that any armourer could reload in under 20 minutes. Cost control showed up in unexpected places. The instrument panel used off-the-shelf gauges shared with Army Air Force trainers. The radio was standard Navy issue, nothing custom. The oxygen system used commercially available regulators. Grumman's purchasing department bought forgings and castings from subcontractors already supplying other military programs, leveraging existing relationships and volume discounts. When Grumman submitted final cost estimates in September 1942, the number came to $58,000 per aircraft at production quantities of 100 units monthly, well within the Navy's budget constraints. More importantly, the design could scale. As production volumes increased, unit costs would decrease. The first prototype, designated XF6F1, made its maiden flight on June 26, 1942. Test pilot Robert Hall's report was underwhelming in the best possible way. The aircraft flew exactly as predicted. No surprises, no mysterious vibrations, no alarming handling characteristics. It did everything competently, without doing anything spectacularly. For military procurement, boring predictability was perfection. While Grumman's engineers were selecting off-the-shelf components in Long Island, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring stood in Focke-Wulf's factory outside Bremen on August 12, 1942, demanding explanations for production shortfalls. The Luftwaffe needed 600 fighters monthly to replace combat losses and maintain operational strength. Focke-Wulf was delivering 380. BMW, the engine supplier, couldn't produce 801 radials fast enough. Specialized components, forged crankshafts, precision-machined cylinder heads, required craftsmen who understood the specific quirks of each engine variant. Germany had perhaps 1,500 workers with these skills. Training more required 6 months minimum. The entire production system was constrained by expertise that couldn't be quickly replicated. This reflected fundamental differences in industrial philosophy. German manufacturing emphasized quality through craftsmanship. Workers spent years as apprentices, learning trades from masters. An aircraft fitter at Focke-Wulf took pride in custom fitting each component, making tiny adjustments to ensure perfect alignment. This approach produced beautiful aircraft, but it was slow. American manufacturing emphasized quality through standardization. Parts were manufactured to precise specifications. They either fit together or they didn't. If a part didn't fit, it was rejected and replaced. Workers needed days of training, not years. This approach produced functional aircraft fast. The difference wasn't about competence. German engineers and craftsmen were extraordinarily skilled, but craft production fundamentally cannot match assembly line output. A master mechanic produces quality. An assembly line produces quantity. In wars of attrition, quantity matters more. Rose Bonavita clocked into Grumman's Bethpage and plant at 6 in the morning on June 11, 1943, joining 8,000 other workers on the day shift. She'd been a department store clerk 9 months earlier. Now she operated a pneumatic riveting gun, driving aluminum fasteners into Hellcat fuselage sections at a rate of 3,000 rivets per shift. Her workstation was position 37 on Assembly Line B, where fuselage halves received internal bracing. She'd never seen a complete Hellcat, didn't need to. Her job was Fuselage Section 4, always Fuselage Section 4, 8 hours daily, 6 days weekly. This was Grumman's revolution, not in aircraft design but in aircraft manufacturing. Leroy Grumman had visited Ford's Willow Run bomber plant in April 1943 and returned obsessed with complete interchangeability. Every part had to fit every aircraft without custom fitting. Wing Section 42 from Supplier A had to bolt perfectly to Fuselage Section 7 from Supplier B. No craftsman, making adjustments. No master mechanics filing edges to achieve proper fit. If parts didn't match exactly, the problem was the part, not the assembly process. Grumman broke the Hellcat into 23 major sub-assemblies: wings, fuselage sections, engine mounts, landing gear, tail surfaces. Each was built on separate production lines by different teams. The fuselage line had 42 stations. A bare aluminum shell entered at Station 1. By Station 42, it emerged with all internal structure, control runs and systems installed. The entire journey took 18 hours. Another line married fuselages to wings. Another installed engines and propellers. Another handled final systems checks and paint. Quality control was statistical, not individual. Inspectors randomly selected parts from batches and measured them against engineering tolerances using precision gauges. If one part in 50 failed tolerances, the entire batch returned to the supplier. This seemed wasteful until you calculated the alternative. Having craftsmen custom fit every part meant production speed collapsed. Grumman's system produced 93 Hellcats weekly by August 1943. Peak production in March 1945 hit 617 aircraft in a single month, roughly one complete fighter every hour around the clock. Women comprised 62% of Grumman's workforce by 1944. Rose Bonavita and her riveting partner June Brundage set a company record on June 14, 1943, 3,345 rivets driven in 6 hours. Management posted their photograph in the factory newsletter. Other teams competed to beat their record. The competition increased average riveting speed 11% over 2 months. When you're driving 4.2 million rivets daily across all Hellcat production, 11% faster means 10 more aircraft weekly. The Germans couldn't replicate this, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked the industrial infrastructure for true mass production. Prefabrication required factories that could produce thousands of identical components with precision tolerances. American industry had that infrastructure from decades of automobile manufacturing, appliance production, consumer goods assembly. Factories were designed around assembly lines, standardized parts, interchangeable components. German industry had limited experience with mass production. Most manufacturing was small-scale, custom work-oriented. Precision parts came from specialized machine shops, not assembly lines. Attempting to replicate American prefabrication methods would have required building entirely new factories, training entirely new workforces, developing entirely new supply chains. Germany didn't have time, resources, or frankly the cultural willingness for that transformation. The Luftwaffe's procurement philosophy remained rooted in the belief that superior engineering could compensate for inferior numbers. This belief was about to be tested at scales that would prove it catastrophically wrong. By January 1944, German intelligence reports reaching Berlin painted an increasingly alarming picture. American carrier task forces in the Pacific were operating with fighter strengths that seemed impossible. Reconnaissance flights over Allied bases counted hundreds of Hellcats, far exceeding the 500 aircraft Germany's analysts had estimated as America's total production. Oberst Werner Streib's revised assessment, submitted on January 18, 1944, suggested the Americans might have produced as many as 1,500 Hellcats. This figure was based on observed carrier deployments, combat loss estimates, and reasonable assumptions about American industrial capacity. Streib noted that, if accurate, this production rate was extraordinary but perhaps sustainable for 6 months, before American resources would need reallocation to other programs. Streib was off by an order of magnitude. By January 1944, Grumman had already delivered 2,545 Hellcats. Production was accelerating, not slowing. The factory in Bethpage was completing aircraft at rates that would have seemed like science fiction to German planners. What Streib and his intelligence staff failed to understand was that American production wasn't constrained by skilled labor shortages or specialized component availability. The entire system was designed to scale infinitely as long as raw materials and factory space existed, and America had both in abundance. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th through 20th, 1944, demonstrated what happened when American industrial capacity met Japanese tactical desperation. 450 F-6F Hellcats from Task Force. .450 Japanese aircraft in what pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese threw everything into this engagement: Zeros, Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo bombers, and the handful of advanced fighters they'd managed to deploy. American radar-guided fighter direction vectored Hellcat combat air patrols precisely where incoming raids were heading. Japanese pilots flew into a coordinated defensive system they had no training to penetrate and no experience to survive. Commander David McCampbell, leading the Essex Air Group, personally shot down 7 Japanese aircraft that day. His Hellcat took multiple hits from return fire. None penetrated anything critical. He landed with 42 bullet holes in his aircraft, refueled, rearmed, and launched again. This ability to absorb damage and continue operating was the Hellcat's defining characteristic. By sunset on June 20th, American forces had destroyed approximately 380 Japanese aircraft. The Hellcats lost fewer than 30. The kill ratio that day approached 13-1. What made the Marianas engagement devastating for Japan wasn't just the aircraft losses. It was the pilot losses. Experienced Japanese naval aviators died that day in numbers Japan couldn't replace. By mid-1944, Japanese pilot training programs were shortened from 18 months to 6 months due to fuel shortages. New pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 100 flight hours. American carrier pilots had 300 hours minimum before seeing combat. Many had 500. Experience gaps this large cannot be overcome by aircraft performance alone. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia developed tactics specifically optimized for the Hellcats' characteristics. His mowing machine formation paired Hellcats in mutually supporting teams, where one pilot was always positioned to attack anything threatening his wingman. This tactic required discipline and communication, not spectacular aircraft performance. Valencia's division destroyed 50 Japanese aircraft between February and May 1944 without losing a single Hellcat. The tactic worked because Hellcats could absorb damage when pilots made mistakes, giving them time to learn. Japanese fighters offered no such forgiveness. One mistake meant death. The industrial implications were profound. When a Hellcat returned to its carrier with battle damage, maintenance crews swarmed it. If the engine needed replacement, the carrier had 3 spare R2800 engines in the hangar deck. If wing sections were damaged, standardized replacement panels bolted on using the same hole patterns every Hellcat shared. Most battle damage repairs took under 48 hours because parts were interchangeable and abundant. This wasn't luck. This was deliberate design philosophy, implemented at every level of production and logistics. German aircraft repairs operated differently. When a Focke-Wulf 190 returned to base with engine damage, finding a replacement BMW 801 meant waiting for one to arrive from the factory, then spending days adjusting the installation because engine mounts weren't precisely standardized. Each aircraft had slight variations that required custom fitting. A damaged Focke-Wulf might sit non-operational for 2 weeks. That aircraft and that pilot were removed from combat strength for the duration. Multiply this across hundreds of damaged aircraft, and you understand why Luftwaffe operational readiness rates declined throughout 1944, despite continued production. The contrast extended to logistics at every level. American carrier task forces operated with massive supply ships carrying everything: engine parts, ammunition, replacement aircraft. When USS Lexington's Air Group lost 8 Hellcats during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, replacement aircraft were aboard within 4 days, flown in from escort carriers serving as transport vessels. The Air Group never dropped below operational strength. Japanese units had no such luxury. Requesting 40 replacement aircraft might yield 11 delivered over 5 weeks, because production couldn't keep pace with losses and the transportation network was crumbling under American submarine attacks. Pilots sat idle, combat-ready but without aircraft. Having the world's best fighter means nothing when it's not available. Fuel scarcity devastated Japanese effectiveness more than any tactical factor. By 1944, American pilot training programs allocated 150 flight hours for advanced fighter tactics, mock dogfights, gunnery practice, formation flying, carrier landing practice. Japanese training programs by late 1944 allocated 60 hours total, with maybe 15 hours in actual fighters. The rest was classroom instruction and glider training because aviation fuel was too precious to waste on student pilots. This created an unrecoverable skill gap. An American pilot arriving at his squadron already knew how to fight. A Japanese pilot arrived knowing how to fly, barely. American statistics from 1944 show that pilot survivability increased dramatically after surviving the first 5 combat missions. Experience mattered enormously, but Japanese pilots rarely survived those first 5 missions to gain experience. The mathematics were brutal. If 70% of new pilots died in their first 5 missions, only 30% survived to become experienced. Of that 30%, if 50% died in the next 10 missions, you're left with 15% of your original pilot training output becoming truly experienced combat aviators. Japan's training infrastructure couldn't produce pilots fast enough to compensate for these attrition rates. America's could, with reserves to spare. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The economic arithmetic was equally brutal. America spent approximately $1.1 billion producing its Hellcat fleet. 12,275 aircraft at roughly $90,000 each by production's end. That spending included not just aircraft but pilot training, spare parts inventories, logistics infrastructure, and replacement aircraft pools. The system was designed so that every dollar spent increased combat effectiveness multiplicatively, not additively. Germany had no equivalent system. They built aircraft. They trained pilots when fuel allowed. They shipped spare parts when transportation was available. But these efforts weren't coordinated into a self-reinforcing system that grew stronger over time. By late 1944, the disparity had become so overwhelming that combat engagements were essentially target practice for American pilots. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 saw Hellcats operating with near impunity. Japanese aircraft that managed to launch were shot down in such numbers that entire air groups ceased to exist as fighting forces. Commander David McCampbell's performance on October 24, 1944, exemplified American dominance. Flying a single Hellcat with his wingman Ensign Roy Rushing, McCampbell engaged a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft heading toward American carriers. In the engagement that followed, McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft. Rushing shot down 6. 2 pilots in 2 Hellcats destroyed 15 enemy aircraft in one mission. Both Hellcats returned safely. Both were repaired, refueled, and flying again within hours. These weren't exceptional circumstances. They were normal operations by late 1944. American pilots were so well trained, their aircraft so reliable, their logistics so comprehensive, that missions which would have been suicide a year earlier were now routine. The Hellcat's 19-to-1 kill ratio reflected this systemic superiority. It wasn't that Hellcats were 19 times better than Japanese fighters. It was that the entire American system, design philosophy, production capacity, logistics infrastructure, pilot training, tactical doctrine, functioned in concert while Japan's equivalent systems collapsed under resource constraints. German observers who studied Pacific air combat through intelligence reports struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with their understanding of warfare. How could American pilots, many with minimal combat experience, consistently defeat Japanese pilots who'd been fighting since 1937 in China? The answer was embarrassingly simple. American pilots flew aircraft that protected them while they learned. Japanese pilots flew aircraft that killed them when they made mistakes. Learning curves favor those who survive their errors. The Hellcat proved that wars are won not by the side with the best equipment, but by the side that can. Field adequate equipment in sufficient quantities, maintain it reliably, and replace losses faster than the enemy destroys it. This lesson was being learned simultaneously in Europe, where American and British bomber streams overwhelmed German air defences through sheer numbers, and in the Pacific, where Hellcats achieved air superiority through production capacity Japanese industry couldn't match. By early 1945, Japan's air forces existed in name only. Pilot quality had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant operational aircraft sat grounded. American carrier task forces operated off the Japanese coast, with 17 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, embarking more than 1,500 aircraft. That strike force could assemble, launch, and recover in under 2 hours. Japan had nothing to counter that level of air power. American carrier strikes ranged freely over Japan, hitting airfields, factories, ports, naval bases. Japanese air defenses were overwhelmed. Japanese fighters were outnumbered 10-to-1, 20-to-1, sometimes more. The final Hellcat combat missions flew on August 13, 1945, 2 days before Japan's surrender. Within 18 months, the Navy retired nearly every Hellcat from frontline service, replacing them with faster, more capable aircraft like the F-8F Bearcat and improved Corsair variants. The Hellcat's combat career lasted barely 3 years. Its influence on military aviation thinking lasted 80 years and counting. Admiral Chester Nimitz's final report on Pacific air operations, submitted November 3, 1945, contained a section that Navy procurement officers would quote for decades. Nimitz wrote that victory came not from superior technology, but from adequate technology in overwhelming quantity, supported by industrial capacity the enemy could not match. He specifically cited the Hellcat as exemplifying this principle, an aircraft that succeeded by being reliable, producible, and available rather than exceptional. This philosophy shaped every carrier aircraft program that followed. When the Navy commissioned design studies for the 14 Tomcat in 1968, one requirement explicitly stated that the aircraft must use engines already in production for other programs. No custom power plants. The 14 got Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engines borrowed from the Phone 11 program. When those engines proved inadequate, the 14 switched to General Electric Phone, 10 engines, again an existing design. The lesson from Grumman's R2800 decision in 1942 remained valid 26 years later. Use proven components that multiple sources can supply. The Soviet Union studied American carrier operations intensely after the war. Soviet naval archives, captured by Western intelligence in 1992, revealed that Stalin personally reviewed reports on Hellcat production methods. Soviet procurement philosophy, for the next 40 years, emphasized numerical superiority over individual superiority. The Mi-21, produced in quantities exceeding 10,000 units between 1959 and 1985, embodied Hellcat thinking. Simple, reliable, good enough, and manufacturable at scale. Modern military procurement still debates this tension. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, beginning in 1996, attempted to create one aircraft serving Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps needs. Commonality would reduce costs through shared components, exactly like the Hellcat's use of off-the-shelf parts. But the F-35's development took 25 years, and costs approached $400 billion. Unit costs exceeded $80 million per aircraft. Critics point to the Hellcat's success and ask whether 3 simpler, specialized aircraft might have served better than one complex common design. The aerospace industry learned manufacturing lessons that trace directly to Grumman's assembly line innovations. Boeing's 737 production system, moving aircraft through sequential stations where specialized teams perform specific tasks, mirrors the Hellcat assembly process. Airbus's modular construction, where major subassemblies arrive from different countries and mate together with minimal fitting, depends on the interchangeable parts philosophy Grumman perfected. These aren't military applications. This is commercial aviation embracing principles proven effective 80 years ago. Business schools teach the Hellcat story in operations management courses. Harvard Business School's case study, Grumman F6F, Design for Manufacturability, has been assigned to MBA students since 1987. The case study's conclusion states that excellence in engineering must be balanced against excellence in production, and that production constraints should inform design decisions from the beginning. This wasn't obvious in 1942. The Hellcat's 19-to-1 kill ratio made it undeniable. What the German intelligence estimates got wrong wasn't just the numbers. They got wrong the entire concept of how America approached industrial warfare. German planners thought in terms of craftsmen building aircraft one at a time, with each unit requiring specialized attention. American planners thought in terms of systems building aircraft by the thousand, with each unit identical to the last. German planners assumed quality meant custom-fitted components and hand-selected materials. American planners knew quality meant parts that always fit, and materials that always met specifications. German planners believed superior engineering could overcome numerical inferiority. American planners proved that adequate engineering in overwhelming quantity beats superior engineering in limited numbers every single time. The 500 Hellcats that German intelligence estimated in late 1943 represented their best guess based on traditional aircraft production paradigms. If you assumed each Hellcat took as long to build as a Focke-Wulf 190, if you assumed American factories operated with German efficiency levels, if you assumed skilled labor was the limiting factor, then 500 aircraft seemed reasonable, perhaps even generous. Every assumption was wrong. Grumman wasn't building Hellcats the way Focke-Wulf built fighters. They were building Hellcats the way Ford built automobiles. The entire industrial process was designed around the question, how do we make 10,000 of these? Not, how do we make the best possible fighter? That question came second. First came, how do we make enough fighters to put one on every carrier deck, with spares in reserve, with replacement aircraft in the pipeline, with maintenance parts stockpiled, with training aircraft for new pilots? Answer those questions, and you end up with the Hellcat. Straightforward design. Proven. Components. Simply construction. Reliable operation. Boring. Predictably. Devastating. By war's end, American records credited Hellcat pilots with 5,156 confirmed aerial victories. Some sources claim as high as 6,477, including all kills by Hellcat pilots in all aircraft types. Against those kills, Hellcat losses to enemy aircraft numbered 270. That's 19 Hellcats shooting down Japanese aircraft for every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat. No other fighter aircraft in history achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio. Not in World War I, not in Korea, not in Vietnam, not in any subsequent conflict. This ratio wasn't about the Hellcat being 19 times better than Japanese fighters. The Zero could still outturn it. The Kawanishi Shiden, when it appeared, could outclimb it. Various Japanese fighters had specific performance advantages, but the Hellcat had systematic advantages. It existed in overwhelming numbers, it was supported by comprehensive logistics, flown by well-trained pilots, maintained by skilled mechanics with adequate spare parts, operating from carriers that could recover and relaunch aircraft faster than Japanese carriers, protected by radar and fighter direction that gave American forces information advantages Japanese commanders never achieved. The mathematics of industrial warfare are unforgiving. If you can build 10 aircraft for every one your enemy builds, and your pilots survive twice as long because their aircraft are more survivable, and your maintenance takes half the time because parts are standardized, the combat effectiveness ratio doesn't multiply, it exponentiates. You don't have 10 times the power, you have 50 times the power. Add in superior pilot training that takes twice as long but produces pilots 3 times more effective, and suddenly you're operating at 100 times the effective combat power of your opponent. These aren't hypothetical numbers. This was the actual disparity between American and Japanese air power by mid-1945. The Germans estimated 500 Hellcats. It was a reasonable estimate based on what they knew about aircraft production. They were wrong by a factor of 24. America built 12,275 Hellcats, and those Hellcats achieved a kill ratio that made them the most successful carrier fighter in aviation history. The lesson extends far beyond one aircraft or one war. It defines how modern militaries think about procurement, production, and the relationship between quality and quantity. Every time defense planners debate whether to buy small quantities of exquisite weapons or large quantities of adequate ones, the Hellcat answers that question definitively. Adequate at scale beats perfect in scarcity every single time. The Germans learned this lesson too late. The Japanese learned it when American carrier task forces appeared with many aircraft that Japanese defenders simply ran out of ammunition trying to shoot them all down. The lesson remains relevant today because the fundamental mathematics haven't changed. Industrial capacity still determines war outcomes more than tactical brilliance. The title of this story captures a profound truth about World War II and about warfare generally. The Germans estimated 500 Hellcats. They stopped counting after that because 500 seemed like an enormous number, perhaps an unrealistic number, certainly a number large enough to represent America's maximum probable output. America built 12,275 and achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio. Those numbers tell everything you need to know about why Germany and Japan lost the war. They tell everything you need to know about how industrial capacity determines military outcomes, and they tell everything you need to know about why the Hellcat, an aircraft that was never the fastest, never the most maneuverable, never the most heavily armed, became the most successful carrier fighter in history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.